Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again. That is where we begin. Not with the diplomats shaking hands in Geneva, not with the carefully worded joint statement, not with the headlines celebrating a new era of de-escalation. We begin at the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf, 21 miles wide at its tightest point, where roughly a fifth of all the oil traded on this planet moves every single day. Iran shut that door, hours after signing a ceasefire that was explicitly designed to open it. I have spent years studying the geography of power, the places where terrain dictates history, where whoever controls a choke point controls the conversation. And I can tell you, with the cold clarity that comes from that kind of study, that what happened in the Strait of Hormuz this week was not an accident, not a miscommunication, not a rogue faction acting without orders. It was a message written in the language that geography understands best: control.
Here is the thesis of everything that follows. The ceasefire was never about peace. It was about leverage, and Iran just proved it. To understand why, you need to see the map the way a strategist sees it, not as lines drawn by diplomats, but as physical constraints that cannot be negotiated away. The Strait of Hormuz is a geological fact. Iran sits on its northern shore. Oman sits on the south. Between them flows the economic oxygen of Japan, South Korea, India, China, and a dozen other economies that built their industrial foundations on the assumption that this water would always be open. For decades, that assumption held. There were threats. There were tanker seizures. There were naval standoffs. But the oil kept flowing, because both sides understood that closing Hormuz would be a form of economic suicide. Iran sells oil too, and a closed strait is a closed strait for everyone. What changed? The answer is layered, and most of it is invisible in the mainstream coverage. First layer, sanctions have already done most of the economic damage. Iran's oil exports have been throttled, rerouted, sold at deep discounts through shadow fleets to buyers who prefer deniability. The financial pain of a prolonged closure for Iran is now measurably less than it was 10 years ago. The threat has become cheaper to execute. Second layer, China. Analysts at the Bank for International Settlements and trade economists tracking UNCTAD data have noted a quiet but significant shift. Iran's economic dependence on Gulf oil infrastructure has declined as its bilateral trade with Beijing has grown. China does not import primarily through Hormuz. Iran knows this. A closed strait hurts its rivals more than it hurts its most important trading partner. Third layer, and this is the one the cameras are not pointing at, the ceasefire itself. Look at who brokered it. Look at the timeline. Look at which regional actors were invited to the table and which were not. The agreement was structured in a way that gave Iran a public diplomatic victory without requiring it to surrender its core strategic asset, the credible threat of closure. Signing the ceasefire cost Iran nothing it actually valued. Closing Hormuz hours later demonstrated that it had given up nothing. This is the logic of the cartographer of power. You do not measure a country's strength by the words it signs. You measure it by the geography it controls and the willingness to use that control as a weapon. Iran has both. Now consider the other players on this board, because in a zero-sum game, every move has a winner and a loser, and the winner is rarely the one holding the press conference. The United States Fifth Fleet operates out of Bahrain, 11 miles from the Iranian coast as the crow flies. Every hour the strait remains closed is an hour the White House must either act or be seen not acting. That is a political cost with a market price. Oil futures move, allies ask questions, and domestic audiences watching their fuel costs want answers. Saudi Arabia has been diversifying its export routes for years, precisely because of this risk. The East-West pipeline, the Red Sea terminals. But capacity is not unlimited, and the margin between what can be rerouted and what cannot is thinner than the reassuring statements from Riyadh suggest. According to figures from the International Energy Agency, alternative capacity covers perhaps 60 to 70% of normal Hormuz flow. the rest becomes a global shortage. China sits in a peculiar position. It is Iran's largest trading partner and simultaneously one of the largest consumers of Gulf oil. Beijing's silence in the immediate hours after the closure was noted by analysts at Chatham House and the Peterson Institute. That silence is itself a form of communication. China has chosen not to pressure Tehran publicly, which tells you something about the private understanding between the two. Russia, whose own energy revenues benefit directly from elevated global oil prices, has expressed what its foreign ministry called concern, a word so carefully selected as to be almost transparent. Elevated oil prices are not Russia's problem. They are Russia's solution. And then there are the countries whose names do not appear in the headlines but whose economies are bleeding quietly. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, nations with limited foreign exchange reserves, limited alternative supply routes, and populations already strained by post-pandemic inflation. For them, a prolonged Hormuz closure is not a geopolitical chess piece. It is a food security crisis. So who benefits? Not the civilians in any of these countries, not the shipping companies watching their insurance premiums triple overnight, not the pension funds holding airline stocks or petrochemical company shares. The beneficiaries are the ones who already anticipated the move. The commodity traders who were long on oil before the ceasefire ink was dry. The governments whose domestic production suddenly becomes more valuable. The political factions inside Iran who argued for years that maximum pressure through geography was more effective than maximum pressure through diplomacy. They now have their proof. And there is a deeper beneficiary, the idea, the doctrine, the precedent. Every time a closure threat translates into a real closure, even briefly, the credibility of future threats increases. The cost of the next ceasefire, for any party negotiating with Iran, just went up. That is a strategic asset that no sanctions regime can confiscate. Consider the historical parallel, because this has happened before, in different water, with different flags. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and demonstrated that a country with limited conventional military power could hold the global economy hostage through geography. The international community's response, divided, slow, ultimately ineffective, taught every subsequent regional power a lesson about the utility of chokepoints. Iran learned that lesson. What we are watching now is its application, refined over decades, executed with the timing of a country that has been planning this moment longer than the ceasefire has existed. What are the realistic scenarios from here? The first, a rapid diplomatic resolution in which Iran extracts a concrete concession, sanctions relief, asset unfreezing, a formal guarantee of non-intervention, in exchange for reopening the strait. This is the scenario that financial markets are pricing in as most likely, because markets tend to assume rational actors will choose the path of least resistance. History suggests this optimism is not always warranted. The second, a prolonged standoff, measured in weeks, in which oil markets reprice, alternative routes reach capacity limits, and the political cost for the United States and its Gulf allies rises to a level that forces a more significant diplomatic offer. This is the scenario Iran may actually be engineering. The third, a miscalculation. A tanker that does not stop when it should. A naval vessel that interprets an ambiguous signal incorrectly. A drone that crosses a line that was never formally defined. History has a library of crises that began as leverage plays and became something no one intended. The fourth, the closure becomes normalized. Not permanently open, not permanently closed, but intermittently threatened. A tool Iran deploys cyclically to reset negotiating conditions. This would represent the most significant long-term shift, because it would permanently alter how global energy markets price political risk in the Gulf. What does any of this mean for you, the person watching this, trying to understand a world that sometimes seems to move faster than the news can explain? It means the peace announcements you read are not always what they appear to be. It means the geography between Iran and the sea is not a peripheral detail in a complex story. It is the story. And it means that the stability you may have assumed was baked into the global energy system rests on agreements that, as of this week, have been revealed to be more fragile than they looked. If you are retired, if your savings are tied to funds exposed to energy markets or international logistics, the volatility of the next few weeks is worth watching, not with panic, but with clear eyes. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed before, in threat and in practice. It has always reopened, but each closure leaves a scar on the assumption that it will remain open by default. Those scars accumulate, and at some point, the assumption fails. What we know, Iran signed a ceasefire and closed the strait. What we do not know, what it will take to reopen it, and at what cost. What the coverage is not telling you, that the closure may have been the point of the ceasefire all along. One question worth sitting with, and I would genuinely like to read your answer in the comments. If you were advising a government today, would you trust a diplomatic agreement that cannot be enforced by geography? Or has the Strait of Hormuz just proven that the map always wins?